Hi everyone, my name's Dr. Mark Ettensohn. Welcome to Heal NPD. This is a follow-up to last week's video, which discussed splitting as a dissociative phenomenon. Many of you asked how these ideas relate to dissociative identity disorder, sometimes called multiple personality disorder, identity diffusion, and other forms of fragmentation. I want to offer some thoughts on that, but before we get into it, I think it's important to step back and clarify something. These aren't discrete disease processes in the way that we often think about medical conditions. The mind only has so many ways to protect itself from overwhelming or unbearable experience, and dissociation is one of the earliest and most robust defenses that we have. As I've discussed in previous videos, it appears to be a hardwired response to trauma. When people ask, what's the difference between dissociative identity disorder, or DID, other specified dissociative disorder, or OSDD, identity diffusion, and splitting, they're often imagining that these are separate illnesses that we've discovered and categorized. But that's not quite right. These are descriptive terms, not explanatory ones. They refer to different points along a continuum of dissociative responses. They're not completely different disorders with distinct mechanisms. The boundaries between them are blurry because we've imposed them, not because they're naturally occurring categories. In some ways, this confusion is baked into the DSM's structure, which promotes a view of psychological suffering that's categorical rather than dimensional. What I want to do in this video is walk through how these phenomena are similar, but also how they differ in degree and structure, and why it's often more useful to think in terms of psychological organization rather than in terms of mutually exclusive, categorical diagnoses. So let's start with splitting, which is something we often see in personality disorders like NPD and BPD. This is a dissociative mechanism that creates barriers between self-states. The person might idealize you in one moment, but devalue or discard you the next, with little awareness of the contradiction. Or they may feel deeply ashamed one day and then grandiose the next. These aren't just mood swings, they're shifts between dissociated self-states that hold incompatible emotional realities. Splitting, in this sense, is an effort to prevent those realities from colliding. It protects the self from internal contradiction that feels both dangerous and destabilizing. Next, identity diffusion. I've discussed this in my other videos, particularly my series on personality organization. Unlike splitting, identity diffusion is defined more by vagueness and incoherence than separated self-states. Images of the self and others tend to lack stability and a coherent organizing theme. The individual may have contradictory self-images, difficulty maintaining values or goals, and a lack of continuity in their relationships. Unlike splitting, which keeps self-states more compartmentalized, identity diffusion reflects an absence of structural cohesion. It's less about dissociation between parts and more about the absence of a unifying, reflective framework. Finally, dissociative identity disorder, or DID, lies at the farthest end of the dissociative spectrum. In DID, self-states, or alters as they're sometimes called, are often more elaborated and structurally encapsulated than with splitting. They may have different names, voices, memories, and even physiological responses. These states are often amnestic of one another, meaning that one might not know what another has experienced. DID is thought to emerge in the context of chronic, early, and overwhelming trauma, when the basic structures of identity are still forming. Even among experts, DID remains something of a mystery. We have models, but like with most disorders, we haven't identified and isolated a neurobiological mechanism that causes it. What distinguishes DID isn't the presence of multiple self-states, because those exist in all of us. It's the depth of the compartmentalization, the autonomy of those states, and the rigidity of the boundaries between them. This makes DID a structural rather than surface-level form of dissociation, one that affects how identity itself is experienced and organized. So, what's the difference, let's say, between splitting and Dissociative Identity Disorder, or DID? Well, again, these differences are mostly in degree, not kind. Splitting is dissociative. It involves compartmentalized self-states, like with DID, each with its own affects, beliefs, and relational templates. In some individuals, those states are so elaborated and self-contained that they may function very much like alters, just without the coherent narrative identity typical of DID. And conversely, DID can present subtly and be difficult to distinguish from severe splitting. All of this reinforces the idea that dissociation is best understood as a spectrum of experience. On the more subtle end, we have things like zoning out during a meeting or becoming emotionally numb in a conflict. And on the more severe end, we have internal states that don't communicate with each other at all. DID reflects the most extreme, structural form of that process. Identity diffusion reflects a lack of cohesion between self-states, and splitting reflects the effort to preserve coherence by keeping incompatible experiences apart. But all of them arise from the same psychological imperative, to preserve some version of selfhood in the face of overwhelming emotional experience. To underscore this dimensional perspective, we can look at how dissociation shows up across diagnoses. The Dissociative Experiences Scale 2, or DES-2, is a widely used measure of dissociative symptoms that often reveals elevated scores in individuals with DID and other trauma-related conditions. But moderate to high DES scores can also appear in people with borderline and narcissistic personality disorders, PTSD, mood disorders, and even psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. Dissociation is not confined to one box. It's a trans-diagnostic mechanism, a core organizing force behind many forms of psychological suffering and pathology. And even the term pathology can be misleading here. Often, these dissociative patterns are not signs of dysfunction, but rather defensive adaptations, solutions that were crafted early in childhood to survive environments that could not be metabolized emotionally. I think many people with personality disorders, especially those with significant early trauma, live somewhere in the middle of the dissociative spectrum. These individuals may have sudden shifts in mood and perception, experience amnesia for certain behaviors, or feel as though they're watching themselves act in ways that they don't fully understand. These aren't alters in the formal sense of DID, but they are dissociated aspects of the self. And this is why reflective capacity matters so much. The developmental shift that I talked about in my previous video on splitting and dissociation, in other words, the ability to observe one's own self-states without completely identifying with or collapsing into any of them, is central to healing. When someone can say, "Part of me feels this, but another part of me feels that," they're building bridges where there used to be walls. To close, I want to emphasize that all of us have multiple self-states. That's not disordered. It's a feature of being human. What becomes pathological is when those states can't communicate, when there's no organizing or observing self that can reflect on the experience and tolerate the internal contradictions. Whether we're talking about splitting or identity diffusion or DID, the therapeutic task is essentially the same: to help the person build that observing self, the one that can know about all the parts without being overwhelmed by any of them. Dissociation is becoming a central lens in how I understand and talk about narcissism. I'll be expanding this in future videos, including what it means for treatment, identity, and recovery. But until next time, take good care.